Hello, and welcome to the Reason Roundtable. I'm Peter Suderman, filling in for Matt Welch, who is offline mixing metaphors like I mix cocktails. Happy Tuesday. Today, I am joined by my regular co-panelists Katherine Mangu-Ward and Nick Gillespie, as well as special guest Zach Weissmueller. Everyone say hello.
Hi.
Hey.
Howdy.
So yesterday was President's Day, and that means that we are going to spend much of this week's podcast talking about presidents. We will start with the current occupant of the White House, Joe Biden, in a segment I will call The Rain in Ukraine Falls Mainly on the Plane.
Boo.
Yeah.
There's
the sigh I was looking for. Okay, so over the weekend, President Biden made a surprise visit to Ukraine, spending time in the capital city of Kiev, where he promised an additional $500 million in aid on top of the tens of billions of dollars the U.S. has already committed. Biden also announced that America was set to impose additional sanctions on Russia with a focus on the energy sector. The visit came on the eve of the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Biden's visit also preceded a major speech planned for today from Poland, in which he was expected to frame the war as a battle for democracy and reiterate his, and thus America's, unwavering commitment to backing Ukraine in the war. Also today, Russian leader Vladimir Putin is expected to deliver a speech making his case for the war, that it is a program of denazification, that it is essential to warding off a threat from NATO, and that it is aimed at reclaiming historical Russian territory, whatever it takes. In short, both leaders are expected to say that they will continue the war until the other one backs down. The result is going to be what the New York Times called a split-screen moment with Cold War parallels, a showdown of sorts between two aging Cold Warriors, one 70 years old and another who just turned 80, who have been circling each other for years and are now engaged in everything short of direct battle. So to start today, I just want to go around the panel and gauge a reaction to Biden's visit and to America's continuing commitment to backing Ukraine in the war. Nick, let's start with you.
I think Biden's visit is fine. He was the last of the major kind of European leaders to actually go to Ukraine. I think our aid is too much and it needs more controls on it. It's not a good thing to be getting into a war, a little bit at a time, like Biden is slipping into a bath that's a little bit too warm for his wrinkled skin. The other thing, I just want to say real quick in the summary that you read, it's really fucking dangerous to keep personalizing these kinds of events. This isn't Putin versus Biden. It's the United States and a bunch of Western nations versus Russia. And just like in the Cold War, there was always an attempt to try and link everything to the personalities of a couple of leaders, one of whom may not even be popularly elected. That's really dangerous. And we need to be focusing on the broader forces that are leading to this kind of standoff.
I think that's fair, although I do also think that Biden and Putin are inevitably the personifications of their nation's policy objectives here. America is doing what Biden wants in Ukraine, and Russia is doing what Putin wants to some degree. It's obviously not just them, but they are pivotal figures here. Katherine, what was your reaction to Biden's Ukraine visit?
I read a bunch of the kind of mainstream coverage of it. And one thing that I was struck by was everyone wants it to be Cold War parallels, but some of the framing actually struck me much more as Iraq War parallels on Putin's side of things. So the New York Times wrote, Vladimir Putin, who a year ago this week believed the Ukrainian capital would become a Russian-controlled territory in a matter of days, moving Mr. Putin closer to his ambition of restoring the empire of Peter the Great, right? And I do think there is something to be gleaned there of, the idea that Putin thought he was going to sweep in, take over, get the job done, get out cleanly. Maybe also a little World War I energy there, a little like this war will be brief and provide opportunities for valor. And then, everyone had trench foot and it was really sad. So I think that there is the temptation to go Cold War parallel is there, but there are many other parallels. Of course, parallels to all wars are bad news in the end because there's still wars. And the other thing I was struck by was many, many quotes that had some variation of, if this war lasts like a really, really long time, Russia has the upper hand. And that's just manifestly true, right? Like there is an expiration on the tolerance of the U.S. Congress, among other things, for financially backing this war. And Putin will do this literally until the day he dies. And I think that was obvious from the beginning. And it's weird to me that we're still doing the, kind of to be sure in mainstream coverage of this war.
I saw a bunch of those quotes too, although several of them that I saw were caveated with Russia will have the upper hand if this lasts for a long time. That is, if the United States and NATO back down. And it basically framed this as a war between Russia and the NATO-U.S. coalition, where it was the NATO-U.S. resolve that mattered actually in some ways more than Ukraine itself. Zach, what was your reaction to the visit?
Well, I agree with Katherine that this has, in a way, demystified both Putin and kind of the might of the Russian military. There was a lot of early speculation that they were just going to roll all the way into Kyiv, and that obviously didn't happen. And it's all part of a demystification that's happened across the world, really. I mean, Trump, I think, taking power in the U.S. had that effect on many Americans' view of our federal government, certainly the executive branch, and now with kind of the decline of Biden there, the might of the U.S. is also in question, and that's why that's one reason I would really reject the Cold War comparison. Most of the Cold War played out before I was born, but just from my understanding of history, there was an appetite for military spending and a kind of post-World War II belief in American might and the federal government being somewhat competent. The space race was really exciting for people. Communism was a clear and obvious threat. And I think now none of that's there. We're on the heels of 2 decades of Middle East wars with very little show for it. Trust and confidence in the federal government's extremely low, and for very good reason. And Russia is a threat to Eastern Europe, but it's so far removed from the power of the Soviet Union and not driven by the pernicious ideology of communism that Americans rightly saw as a threat to their way of life. The main parallel I see with the Cold War at this point is the occasional and terrifying saber rattling about the use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, so I agree with that. This isn't Cold War II, Cold War Harder, right? It's not a direct sequel. It's more like the
Legend of Curly's Gold.
Cold War II,
exactly
Electric Boogaloo.
City Slickers 2.0 rather than Die Hard 2.
Yeah, so Nick, I want to ask you about Die Hard 2. No, I don't, actually. I want to ask
yes, you do.
I like it. It's an Easter movie. We need more Easter movies.
One of the only movies set at the Dulles Airport. Now, normally we give the Biden tweets to Katherine, but today I want to read a White House tweet. So it's technically from the White House official accounts, and I'll read that to you and then ask you about that.
I'm all on edge, waiting to hear it.
Yeah, so the tweet is, today, President Biden is in Kyiv to reaffirm America's unwavering commitment to Ukraine's democracy, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The United States of America will stand with the Ukrainian people for as long as it takes. And I want to focus in on 2 little passages there. One is just one word, unwavering. And the second is the final set of words, as long as it takes. So does this sound more than a little like an unofficial declaration of war, or at least proxy war, on the part of the United States against Russia? I mean, an unlimited commitment to backing a war. Sounds like you're a participant in the war. It sounds like we're at war. What do you make of this?
I think that what that is about, it's 2 tracks. One is that it is a message to Putin. That along with the rest of Europe, the United States is not going to sit idly by when territorial, integrity is broken. And the other thing that he's doing, because I'm sure we'll get to this, but as 2024 looms, what he is doing is he is setting out an agenda that the Republicans will respond to in Congress. And I think, almost always foreign policy in the United States is a function of domestic policy. And what he's trying to do is to define the Republican Party as a pro-Putin party with this kind of rhetoric. Because when people say, and Republicans, they haven't figured out how to do this quite yet, because they love the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and they love the American military. And now they're going to be saying, no, we need less of that. Are they going to talk about cutting defense spending? Biden has, last year as well as this year, he's looking at record-setting budget calls for the Defense Department and things like that. I think that tweet is as much about domestic policy and setting creating a difference between him and the likely Republican candidates for president.
Zach, is there a way to back down from this without caving in to Russia's territorial aggression? I mean, Putin is in the wrong here. Russia's war is a war of aggression. There's no justification for it. So how should the U.S. respond to such a flagrant violation of international norms, not to mention human rights abuses, just like also killing an awful lot of people in a war for territory? Like, what should the United States, first of all, maybe one way of thinking about this question is, what should the United States have done from the beginning? But now that we're in the position we're in, what should we do now?
Yes. So Nick and I actually talked with Emma Ashford about this question. She is in the realist camp, and I have an increasing level of sympathy towards that idea that we need to assess the fact that, or recognize the fact that the U.S. is by far the largest monetary and weapons contributor to Ukraine at this end. With that comes a responsibility to think about the end game from the beginning. And, unfortunately, there's, no fairy tale ending here where Russia, I think, gets pushed back beyond that Russia gains no territory whatsoever. There's going to be some sort of compromise. I cannot say what that is going to be. But so far, the U.S. has shown zero interest in kind of flexing that power they have as a provider and backer of Ukraine to bring the parties to the table to try to broker that. And that's what's concerning to me, especially when I continue to hear that rhetoric of, an endless commitment there's no discussion of that, and that's what I find really disturbing about our current predicament.
If I may, to the question that you asked, Zach, towards the end there, it will be extremely easy, assuming that some kind of diplomacy is happening, if the United States and if Joe Biden can say, you know what, I brokered an end to the war in Ukraine, and parts of Ukraine are now effectively or openly under Russian control. I'm a peacemaker. People in America would love that. I think, just from a political point of view, because everybody knows that Ukraine is not in the, essential national security interest of the United States. A fairly stable Europe is. But if Biden presides over an end to this war, nobody cares what he said right up until the minute that the peace papers are signed.
And it is kind of like, a lesson learned somewhat. Like, that's part of this, right, is that you don't want to send the message that a power like Russia can invade a sovereign country like Ukraine and pay no cost. They have paid a cost. They've paid a very high cost. And part of the agreement, can be continuing to pay that cost. But I think you're right that that there is a way to bring, be the peacemaker, run in 2024 as the peacemaker president, and I think that would be at this point in our kind of fiscal domestic situation, that would be a powerful message.
So, since Zach brought up the fiscal aspect here, I want to ask you, Katherine, what you think about the finances here. Another $500 million is in the scheme of a $6 trillion federal budget. Honestly, not all that much money, but it is on top of about $113 billion or so in various forms of aid, military and non-military, that Congress has already approved. And as the White House tweet reminded us, this is an unwavering commitment for as long as it takes. That does not sound like this is $113 billion and no more. It sounds like there's a lot more coming. What do you think of this, and how should we be thinking about the fiscal aspect of America's backing Ukraine in the war?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the 21st century, all of America's wars, or proxy wars, semi-wars, kind of wars, I don't even know what this is, they're all forever wars. Like, that's just one way to think about it is, in the same way that there's this line that I keep coming back to of, don't pass a law unless you're willing to kill someone to enforce it. Like, don't get involved in international conflict unless you're willing to be in that conflict forever. I think that is a rule of thumb that we pretend isn't real. Like, there was when we passed the first and the second and the third and the fourth package of aid to Ukraine, each time there was this fiction, this pretense that maybe after this, I don't know, Ukraine was going to be independent and really just strike out on its own to finish up this war. Like, I don't know what the theory was, but that was kind of the unspoken implication, even though everyone who knew anything about anything recognized that that was not the case. So yeah, $113 billion is a lot of money. And there is no clear path. In fact, Biden is signaling he's not even looking for a path to shrink that number or to bring it down to zero. And I think it matters. There's this sort of phenomenon, right, where when you ask Americans, hey, how can we cut the federal budget? There are a few things that they want to cut. And one of them is foreign aid. And that's a stupid answer because foreign aid is a very small part of the federal budget and the problem is entitlements. But it shows something about where American sentiments are with respect to this. And it's not $113 billion every year for forever. That's not where American people, by and large, end up if you ask them the question abstractly. Now, I do think, as long as it takes, as Zach and Nick have both noted, could easily be until the U.S. gets sick of this, pressures Ukraine to come to a negotiated settlement, and then everyone kind of says, like, oh, we figured it out and it's over now, which, I think that's to some extent outside of the control of the U.S. I will say, I don't know how much we want to get into it, but I talked with some folks here in D.C. this weekend who are not...
You live in Washington, D.C.?
I live in Washington, D.C. And here in D.C. this weekend, I talked to some folks who are not terribly political, but happened to be down on the mall for President's Day. And they bumped into a big rally down there. And they were like, hey, were these your guys? Was this you? Whatever that was, that's not the way out either. Just to be clear, standing in front of a bunch of Russian flags shouting about Julian Assange is not going to solve this problem either. So for what it's worth, we don't have a lot of good options, and I get that.
All right. Speaking of races, contests that don't have a lot of good options, let's talk about the GOP presidential race. On the other side of the aisle, the 2024 Republican presidential primary is heating up with a new entrant into the field and some revealing sniping between the players and expected players. So we're going to name this segment after the widely recognized modern classic Adam Sandler movie, Little Nicky. Yes, folks, that's right. Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina and U.S. ambassador to the UN, is officially running for president. Haley has been swimming in GOP waters for well over a decade, but she's running on a theme of welcome to the next generation. Over the weekend, she tweeted out, "We keep hearing the same thing across the country. Americans are tired of the status quo. They want a leader with fresh ideas and a track record of success." Nick, you're tired of this status quo, aren't you?
Yeah.
So what, if anything, what does Haley bring to the GOP race? Is she really the next generation of Republican?
No, and I would have named this section Darling Nikki rather than Little Nikki. Peter, you wouldn't even have had to change the spelling of her name.
I'll ask for submissions next time.
Yeah. I think that would be a good thing, and bury him in them.
We're gonna do a segment naming contest.
What Nikki Haley brings is a completely forgotten record as a two-term governor of South Carolina, where, according to the Cato Institute, she increased outlays or oversaw an increase in outlays of 38%. And in 2016, the last time they did their gubernatorial scorecard when she was in office was a D. From a libertarian perspective, there's not a lot in Nikki Haley. She left office, worked for Donald Trump at the UN for a while, and had a semi-acrimonious break with him about that, but not so much. I mean, she's, give her credit for getting out there first, but she, as far as I can tell, other than the shot that people over 75 in politics should have to go through some kind of reading comprehension or mental competency test, she's added very little to the discourse. And I predict she'll early in, early out.
Zach, normally I play the role of Florida man on this podcast, but you actually live in Florida now, like today, by choice even.
In DeSantis-stan, you mean?
Yeah. That's exactly what I mean. So, right, you're living under the governorship of Ron DeSantis, who has not officially announced a run for president, but is widely expected to be the main rival to former President Trump. With this early announcement, though, it does seem like maybe Haley wants to play that role too. So how do you see the contrast between Haley and DeSantis? What does that tell us about the state of the GOP field and the race that we can expect to see over the next couple of years?
Yeah, so the comment that I saw her make about DeSantis was, so DeSantis has, famously passed this law here called the Parental Rights and Education Act. Critics call it the Don't Say Gay law, and says, grades K through 3, you can't talk about gender identity or sexuality. And Nikki Haley was like, I think that's really wrong. It should be K through 7. And so it's like, if her strategy is going to be, Ron DeSantis isn't Ron DeSantis-y enough, I really don't think that's going to work for her. Because, you can agree or disagree with his policies, but it's pretty clear to anyone paying attention that he's pushing this stuff forward with more force than just about any other politician with a national profile. And honestly, that's also some of Trump's challenge, because he's out there saying, look, Florida actually did lock down for a couple of months, and like nobody is going to buy any of that. We all saw what happened. And, if someone is going to cut a real contrast with Trump and DeSantis, I think you'd want someone who actually wants to offer a path for transcending the culture wars, and also wants to break with the really protectionist and heavy-handed national conservatism that Trump brought into the party, and that I think DeSantis is kind of distilling, that allows a lot of space for the government to shape social policy. And so that is when I will get a little more excited for an entrant into the GOP race, but I'm not holding my breath.
This is about an unwavering commitment to the war on woke, right? The GOP candidates are going to fight for as long as it takes against public school teachers. Okay, Katherine, you may not have noticed, but here's something about Nikki Haley. She's a woman.
Thank you.
Specifically,
Matt Welsh.
Could you, what is a woman, Peter? Define that before we continue.
That was actually my question for Katherine. No, so specifically, she's a woman running for the presidential nomination of the Republican Party, which has led to headlines like this one from the New York Times. Haley walks treacherous road for GOP women. Nikki Haley's presidential campaign is a major test of her party's views on sexism and female leaders. Just don't call it identity politics. So, Katherine, if you're not going to call it identity politics, what are you going to call it? And more seriously, there is, in fact, a completely undisguised gender dynamic here. Part of Haley's own pitch is that she, and this is a quote, is a tough-as-nails woman. What do you think about that?
I read this New York Times article with it. It just was like pure rage right into my veins, because the gotcha of this piece, the clever twist that the New York Times came up with, was the GOP says identity politics are not good for America, but Nikki Haley is still acknowledging on the campaign trail repeatedly that she is a lady.
Ooh, got her.
Woo!
Wow.
They nailed her to the wall with that one. It's thousands of words. This is like a long, thinky piece. And it's just over and over, they say they don't like identity politics, but then she mentioned that she wears heels. Ha! It's like, okay. So obviously there's going to be a lot of that for as long as she's in the race. I tend to agree that we may as long as she is in the race, may not be that long. And that's fine with me because I just don't see anything particularly appealing about her political ideology as I can discern it, or how she would govern insofar as I can tell. I think that there is going to be a pretty delicious moment, though, if she does make it through fairly far in the campaign, where people on the left will potentially be forced to confront, here's a path breaker, a woman, like, we're supposed to celebrate this, and yet she's a Republican and therefore a moral monster. So what can we do? How can we celebrate female success while also just hating Republicans with all of our beings? I guess it's helpful that thanks to Kamala Harris, she won't be the first, woman of Asian descent. She won't be the first. I mean, Harris has beat her to some of those firsts, unless she actually cinches the nomination and the presidency. So maybe they can just avoid that conversation altogether. But yeah, the gender politics of Nikki Haley are going to be excruciating. I do hope that people are able to kind of get it out of their systems quickly, along with the racial politics, which have already been embarrassing for everyone involved, including this, she made up her name, she anglicized her name fight, which she has had over and over in her career, and is going to have again as she reintroduces herself to more and more larger swaths of the American public. But yeah, she has all the same problems of DeSantis, as far as I can tell, as a substantive leader, but less of the appeal. And so I just don't know why anyone would be getting on the Haley bandwagon at this point.
Embarrassing for everyone involved is a great segue to my next question, which is for Nick, and it's about Donald Trump. Donald Trump has more or less officially been running since late last year, although he hasn't always acted like it. But at this point, he's starting to step up his game, in particular by attacking his rivals. After promising not to call Ron DeSantis Meatball Ron.
I really love that, too, by the way.
I swear is like a Lost Garbage Pail Kids character, if you remember those from the 1980s.
Oh, yeah. No, totally.
Yes.
Totally. Yeah.
I would
He's
definitely
got worms coming out of his face and
be
things like
so
that.
excited if that were in my Garbage Pail Kids a collectible card pack. So after promising not to use that nickname, Trump recently posted on his social network, Truth Social, Ron DeSanctimonious wants to cut your Social Security and Medicare, closed up Florida and its beaches, loves rhinos, Paul Ryan, Jeb Bush, and Karl Rove, disasters all, there's some exclamation points, some capital letters here, is backed by Globalists Club for No Growth, Lincoln Pervert Project, and Uninspired Coke. And it only gets worse from there. I'm assuming he's talking about his own tweets. He is a rhino in disguise. That's Trump again. So that's a bunch of words and exclamation points, which are kind of funny in a way. But in some ways, it adds up to a more or less coherent critique. What Trump is saying, more or less, is that Ron DeSantis is a conventional Republican of the sort who routinely won state and national races in the Republican Party right up until 2015 when Trump entered the picture. So what does it say about the state of the Republican Party, and really the state of American politics, when someone of Trump's stature, a former president, a likely 2024 presidential nominee again, when he's complaining that the other candidate in the Republican race is too Republican, I guess? What do you make of that?
I don't really understand. I mean, one of the things that it clarifies is that Trump, who in 2 consecutive presidential races got around 46, a little bit more than 46% of the popular vote, has nowhere to go. I think, his role going forward in the Republican Party and in national politics is to kneecap whoever the Republican candidate is. It could be him or it could be somebody else, but it's part of his following is going to be against the Republican candidate, no matter who it is. And I think in his incoherence, he was able to, kind of capture a public mood, particularly against somebody like Hillary Clinton, with a bunch of complaints that were scattered and don't make sense as a critique of anything. The really troubling aspect to me is the fact that people like Ron DeSantis, Meatball Ron Sanctimonious, all of that kind of stuff, like they're not talking about anything that has to do with overall federal spending and the effect that that has on the economy or on the ability of America to regenerate itself, to respawn.
Well, to the extent they are talking about it, it's to just absolutely take off the table any kind of cuts to old age senior entitlements, right? Because for fairly straightforward political reasons, which is that a lot of older people vote Republican.
Well, and also defense spending, right? I mean, like you don't hear it's virtually impossible for a Republican. The only person who really got far doing this was Ron Paul, to some degree Rand Paul, but if you are not going to be massively trimming or talking about a different way of funding Social Security, Medicare, and defense spending, you cannot cut any spending whatsoever.
I don't know if you saw that
and that's
clip,
where we're at.
I don't know if you saw that clip circulating, I think, in the Trump circles of DeSantis back, because DeSantis was, a Tea Party guy back in the day, and he was on tape talking about, kind of privatizing or means testing Social Security, and then that was being used by the Trump team to go after him. So to Nick's point, like, yes, this is now Trump is trying to make like the absolute sanctity of Social Security and the entitlement state, new GOP orthodoxy.
Which it has been, though. I mean, that's the most important thing, at least since Reagan in his second term, when he said saving Social Security and Medicare for another generation was his greatest accomplishment in office. And this is a guy who effectively won the Cold War. The Republicans have never been serious about actually cutting any of this stuff. And this is where somebody like Nikki Haley, who is not going to go anywhere, it would have been fascinating if she actually articulated a different framework for what the federal government is for, how much should it spend and what should it be. But we're obviously not going to get that from the Republicans this time.
I do think there has been a real shift here.
I will put in a little hype for our cover story of the next issue, which should be hitting your inboxes and mailboxes right about now. Eric Boehm wrote about DeSantis, and he starts with DeSantis's Tea Party past. And I think Nick is quite right that there was never a moment where Republicans were seriously focused on cutting or majorly reforming entitlements, but there was a moment, and that was the moment that DeSantis's career was born, in which they sounded like they meant it. There were, of course, still the Tea Party signs that said "government hands off my Medicare" and all that, but there are plenty of gotchas in DeSantis's past. If what you are looking for is evidence that he might have at some point thought our current entitlement system is unsustainable, and said that out loud. So in that sense, I want to believe that guy is in there somewhere, but I actually like Ron DeSanctimonious because that is who he's running as now.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. I mean, the Tea Party had many, many problems, both in terms of the way it conducted itself, it's just sort of in its attitudes, in its level of seriousness, in what it evolved into, I think. But it is pretty remarkable that post-Tea Party Republicans have rejected basically everything that the Tea Party stood for, even if only rhetorically, in favor of I'm not even actually sure what, right? There's a faction of Republicans at this point who are against just about everything, including, it seems, the Republican Party itself. Okay, so let's go to an advertisement here. Self-reliance, planning ahead, using our heads. Those are just a few of the things we believe in here at the Reason Roundtable, and that's why we'd like to tell you about the Air Medcare Network membership and how it can take a financial worry off your plate. Air Medcare Network is America's largest emergency air ambulance membership network. Air Medcare Network providers operate state-of-the-art helicopters, and their specially trained medical personnel provide the highest level of pre-hospital medical care in emergency situations. Even with insurance, these flights can be very expensive. But when you're an Air Medcare Network member, you won't see a bill for your flight, only when flown by one of their providers. This is a financial safety net you should have. Membership is amazingly affordable, only $99 per year and just $79 for seniors. And your entire household is covered. Right now, our listeners get up to an $80 MasterCard or Amazon e-gift card when they join AMCN and use offer code REASON. Visit airmedcarenetwork.com/reason today. All right, so next we have a question from listener Afton Wolf, who says he's a big fan. Happy Monday, except it's Happy Tuesday here. So the question is, I'm sure you've discussed it before, but where do you guys fall on intellectual property rights? A number of libertarians seem to think that intellectual property is not actual property, that ideas are for everyone. They say these intangibles are not eligible for property rights, and that copyright and patent systems particularly enable monopolies and abuses of said system. And then with AI advancement, and this is, I think, the most interesting part of the question gets murkier as to who owns it. The monkey taking the picture or the photographer who left the camera for it, right? So if ChatGPT or DALL-E or whatever one of these AI systems is taking material that is copyrighted by other people and then modifying it, what then? The listener writes, I don't necessarily believe that there has to be a government registry to protect these rights, but I also see intellectual property as originating and therefore belonging to the creator. This person is a creative themselves, and they like to think of creativity more as discovery. And just like if someone found a vein of gold, that person would have senior and superior rights to exploit it. What say you, panelists? Also, I will say this person is a musician. You can check out their music online. So, Nick, what do we think about intellectual property rights in the age of AI?
I think the current basic framework of intellectual property is plus or minus 200 years old. It is due for a major rethink because, unlike what the letter writer says, intellectual property is explicitly in the Constitution a government-granted monopoly for a certain period of time. We used to write a lot about this towards the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. The copyright terms in particular keep getting extended every time Mickey Mouse and a couple of other properties are about to become public domain. The abuse of that led to a kind of copyright anarchism, which resides heavily in libertarian circles, and I'm very sympathetic towards it. The main thing to think about, I think, over the past 20 years, and as we're going into an AI phase where all sorts of stuff is going to be, written or produced without clear provenance, consumers, and this is ultimately what it's about. It's not about actually protecting creators' rights because people keep creating stuff whether or not there's copyrights. But consumers and industries can flourish as long as consumers can get a steady, reliable flow of material. All of the arguments about Napster in the late 90s kind of faded. There were I think indefensible government actions to take down Napster and things like that. But once you get Pandora and Spotify and people have reliable, good streaming to basically everything, and you throw in SoundCloud where people who don't have record label deals can get their stuff out, or YouTube or whatever, the issue about copyright really kind of retreats. The business models will change, but the real main thing is that are people able to find the stuff that they want to consume? That's really what's going to govern all of this. And then we'll write the laws after the fact to kind of justify a system that's working for people.
Zach, you are a creator of video content yourself. How do you feel about AI coming in and taking it and transforming it, combining it with other things and making something new out of it?
I do want to point out that Zach technically doesn't own any of his intellectual property. It's all Reason.
That's right. And Reason actually doesn't own it. We put all our videos in the Creative Commons and people take it and remix it all the time. So, I mean, it's legitimate for artists, creators to want to monetize their work, of course, and people are generally very happy to pay for it in different ways. Luckily, the digital era has allowed for these new business models to spring up, whether it's crowdfunding or a nonprofit backing you, or corporations figuring out ways to present their content in more accessible, easy ways, like creating their own streaming service. But I think that's where most of this, especially when it comes to the arts, should rest with the creators to figure out ways to make money and to create a little walled garden or whatever around their content. I don't think we need the government so involved in protecting copyright at this point, because the argument that the framers put forth is that it's purely utilitarian. Does it incentivize useful products in the realm of arts, in the useful arts and sciences? And in the arts, I tend to think that it mostly incentivizes retreads of valuable IP when you look at the output from Hollywood, for instance. In the sciences, patents and so forth, maybe there's a stronger case for it sometimes, but even there, Elon Musk has thrown a lot of those assumptions into question by open sourcing a lot of his technology. So, I'd say I am on the border between an IP anarchist and an extreme IP skeptic at this point.
Katherine, this isn't exactly the listener's question, but we were talking before the podcast about how the online science fiction magazine Clark's World shut down submissions this last week. Guess why? Because they had been flooded with AI-written science fiction short stories. What do you think about this weird new world of AI art generation, about the copyright implications, but also about the implications for, say, magazine editors who have to read slush piles?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that this weekend. We do get a bunch of submissions over the transom, and we sometimes run them. It is probably only a matter of time before we publish a partly or wholly AI composed article without knowing it at all. And I think that that's both a little terrifying and kind of great. Like I generally think when you look at an area of law that seems sort of internally contradictory or extremely corrupted by cronyism or just difficult to enforce, it's very rare that we correct those problems with legal reform. It does happen, but the idea that there's kind of going to be one big brain that's going to say, okay, we're going to rewrite these laws and now they're going to work. Instead, we have technologies that emerge and just break the whole thing, right? Just shatter it into pieces. And I think that that's kind of where we are with IP right now, that it's slow moving. I think I would also put it maybe beginning, as Nick notes, with the kind of Napster moment and coming to its fruition today, and that it's just going to be unsustainable to continue to behave as if intellectual property is real property in the sense that our law has attempted to embody it for the last couple hundred years. It doesn't mean that what happens at the far end of that is something good, right? We could easily end up with a sort of semi-dystopian copyright troll scenario where everyone is just, it's a sort of war of all against all for a while. But as Virginia Postrel has written over the years many times, there are already plenty of areas of creative and intellectual endeavor where there aren't strong intellectual property protections, and those areas are thriving, including recipes and fashion, perhaps not coincidentally, traditionally female pursuits. And I think that if everything heads that way, we could certainly do worse than to have our some of our other industries behave more like those industries. And Zach is right. People will figure out how to make money. Like, there's always a premium. There's always a pro. There's always a plus. And I think, the same tools that have broken IP or are breaking IP as it previously existed are also providing opportunities for creatives to make money.
There are people on this podcast who have benefited from the fact that you cannot copyright a list of ingredients.
We've all benefited from that, actually.
Yeah, I know. It's like everybody does. And it's also, when you look at places like Patreon and Substack, there are more ways now for individual creators in a disintermediated way where you don't have to go through a big recording label or a corporation that is going to take a massive cut and control the actual, distribution of your work. Things are actually very good for small creators, for a kind of bespoke, artisanal creative community in a way that they haven't been for a very long time. I recommend reading Grant McCracken's The Return of the Artisan, and also almost 10 years ago, no, it can't be 10 years ago, it's about 8 years, whatever, sometime in the past. Which
time is
doesn't matter. It increasingly. But I talked with Glenn Platt, who's a professor of interactive media studies at Miami University, about what he calls the intimacy economy. And for decades, long before Napster, artists were moving into a different relationship with audiences who increasingly had more options to go elsewhere. And you do it by offering premium, offering early looks, things that Katherine was mentioning just a couple minutes ago. That is going to proceed apace, because what people want is a connection with a source of creativity that they like. That's why podcasts, like Blocked and Reported or The Fifth Column that Matt co-founded and co-hosts, it's the community as much as anything else that is really driving engagement, money, and creativity. So we're in an incredibly fertile period, partly because copyright no longer can cast as long of a shadow, and the means of cultural production have been democratized in radical ways.
Incredibly fertile, except for national birth rates.
Being in the YouTube space, I've seen this firsthand. I mean, YouTube has played a big role in expanding kind of the definition of fair use, where you take a pre-existing media clip and then just by offering some commentary on it, you are freely able to use it. That is a inherently murky concept, and YouTube creators, I think, have helped to expand that, and it's beneficial to the smaller creators to have more material to work with. And so if the goal here is, more abundance, more creativity, I would say the practical effects are that a looser IP regime seems to incentivize that, and a tighter IP regime seems to disproportionately benefit the kind of, wealthier firms that have really valuable IP.
All right. So Katherine's mention of systems that are unsustainable is a good setup for our final newsy segment, in which we are going to look very briefly at the ongoing debt entitlement and economic situation for a segment I'll call The Prices Aren't Right, Bob. Here are three pieces of news that happened in the last week or two. First, the Congressional Budget Office released new projections showing that by 2033, federal government will spend as much on Social Security as it does on military and all other discretionary spending. Over the next decade, the CBO says America will add about $19 trillion in new debt. Second, following an inflation report showing that consumer prices rose 6.4% from a year prior, which is down from a peak in July, but still rising quite quickly, Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell warned that the path to reducing inflation in the U.S. is probably going to be bumpy. And finally, Senator Rick Scott, Republican of Florida, dropped his push to sunset Social Security and Medicare following attacks and criticism from both President Biden and Republican leadership in Congress. Nick, put all of that together for me. What have we learned?
We've learned that the government is not going to be the brake on government spending. It's going to have to come from pressure from outside, either economic reality, red and tooth and claw, or by motivated special interest groups, i.e. voters, who change the direction of all of this.
Zach, you have done some reporting on inflation. Wasn't it just a couple of years ago that some folks, mostly on the center left, were actually saying that more inflation would be good? Are those people happy now?
Yeah, well, I did a video where I spoke with John Cochran, who's a debt hawk, and then Jason Furman, who, well, maybe more of a debt inflation dove, let's say, also served in the Obama administration. And yeah, he told me at the time that just, a little bit of inflation would actually be good for an economic recovery coming out of COVID and the lockdowns. I don't think that he meant this much inflation, and his Harvard colleague Larry Summers at the time had been warning that the Biden packages were way too big and were going to cause this. I think that basically we're paying the price for lockdowns, what they did to the supply chains and the monetary supply now. And it's an increasingly hefty and really unfair price. It's one of those issues that you hear people who aren't even that politically engaged talk about because they see it and they feel it. It's this kind of insidious hidden tax. And I don't know. The fact that we're just supposed to kind of trust the steady hand of Jerome Powell to guide us to a soft landing or a slightly bumpy landing, I hope to God that happens, but
something other than a crash.
Yeah. And, even if that does happen, which I really hope it does, it's just really unsettling that this is the system that we have. And we just got to hope Powell and his team have really got this one figured out.
Katherine, that's a good segue for my question to you. So I want you to do something that I think will be a little bit uncomfortable for you, Katherine. Maybe a little out of your wheelhouse. I want you to imagine that you are an ordinary person. Like you're just like a normal middle class dude, lady type person out there living your life, listening to the Reason Roundtable every week, excited about segment names, and you don't have a lot of individual direct control over the federal budget, over big economic decisions made in Washington. And yet what we've seen over the past couple of years is that those decisions have a big effect on your life. So I want to be clear that I am not asking you for financial advice here, at least not in the regulated by the SEC sense, but maybe give us some financial advice? No, not financial advice. What I want to know is how should ordinary people respond here? Should we just hope the economy is an airplane and that Jay Powell is a good pilot?
Yeah, it's very, very hard for me to put myself in the shoes of this hypothetical ordinary person. Or maybe it isn't, because the ordinary person and I have this in common. We have no idea what's going to happen. There is absolutely no way to make informed decisions. It seems like there are some sort of very, very basic things like, stockpile eggs or whatever. That's a prudential thing to do. But
that's limited by refrigerator space.
I mean,
at least in the United States.
So I think ordinary people in America now all have like a refrigerator in their garage, is my understanding, or at least that's what I hear. So they have room for eggs. Yeah, I don't know. My personal path has been to not own a house, not own a car, and just hope that in general, like the government doesn't notice me very much. And that's working out fine so far. But I guess I could improve my odds of that by like moving to Florida with Zach, where the government notices people less by and large. I don't know. I agree.
Unless they're teaching woke books in public school. Yeah.
And then it's straight to jail. Overcooked fish also straight to jail. I don't know. I think the ordinary person is probably understandably baffled, just as I am. I have nothing. This is actually something I also struggle with when people say, well, what's the better system? Like, how do we do this better? And I don't know how to answer that question without tearing up all of it, right? I don't know how to answer that question without just positing a radically different world in which we have abolished the Fed, right? I mean, shout out to my Ron Paul revolutionaries. But it's quite right that our best case is a bumpy landing, if not a crash. And we don't even have the mechanism of voting, which, as I'm on record in this podcast, I don't think is a great mechanism for for accountability. But we don't even have that with respect to our financial fates.
All right, let's see if we can bring.
Do you have any advice on that? Because I mean, you asked the question, answer it.
No, I asked the question because I don't have any advice. And I actually wonder what the best way to think about this is if you are someone, especially who is not a sort of professionally involved in politics, if you're someone who is trying to do something else with your life. And I think it's a genuinely difficult question. And it's a question that our politics kind of increasingly implicitly asks without ever stating. Because so much of our politics now is just about political leaders saying, basically, trust me. Like you again, and it is in some ways the airplane metaphor works here because we all get out of airplanes and none of us know how to fly. None of us know like what Boeing's
But we know
system.
just as well as politicians how to crash a plane.
Right.
So maybe we storm the cabin.
And so you do in the modern world just trust in these systems, and they basically work. And in fact, airplane crashes in the United States, airplane deaths are like at an all-time low here, or pretty close to it. At the same time, that's not true with politics, and that's not true in the economy. And I don't, so again, the metaphor sort of makes sense as a metaphor, but I don't think it makes sense as an appropriate response to how to think about the economy. At the same time, what other choice do we have? This is the world we live in, and it is very difficult to change. I think the big thing that I would just say to people is, try to take care of yourself. Try to build resilience into your life, and to the extent that you can get involved in politics in productive ways that might actually change this. Maybe not in the short term, but in the long term, that might be something that is worthwhile and worth doing. So let's try to land this podcast and bring it in for a soft landing with our final segments. What you watching, Zach? What have you been watching, reading, otherwise consuming in the past week or so?
Well, I completed the Madoff, the Monster of Wall Street Netflix series, which I bring up in part just to shamelessly self-promote the Reason TV video coming out today that tears it apart. It's a great series in that it explains in great detail exactly the mechanics of what Madoff did. It talks with the journalists who were on the ground, some of the regulators on the periphery, and it explains exactly how the SEC missed red flag after red flag after red flag, and then proceeds to make the point that we need to fund the SEC more and layer on more and more regulations. And
the regulators are very bad at their jobs. Therefore,
yes,
let's do more of
regulations. Yes. So I took some issue with that, and you can see exactly what kind of the nature of my critique there is by logging into YouTube and Reason TV's channel today.
Nick, what about you?
I watched Station 11, which is an HBO series that came out in December of 2021. So it's a little bit more than a year old. It's based on a 2014 novel by a woman named Emily St. John Mandel. And it is about a post-apocalyptic world that the novel was written before COVID. It was about kind of based off the worst possible outcomes of a swine flu that knocks out, 90% of the population of Earth. The HBO show is fantastic because it came out obviously during the pandemic. And it's a great haunting reminder of what lockdown was like and what do you do in a world where suddenly everything has changed and the future looks incredibly bleak. What I particularly find deeply moving about the series, which is incredibly well acted. It's haunting in every possible way, but is that there's a movement through time, which calls to mind things like Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks album, et cetera, where you never know what is exactly the actual moment in time because it's going forward, backwards, sideways, et cetera. But Station 11, it was one of the very best things I've seen in a world where there are too many good TV shows to watch. I really recommend Station 11 because I think it'll bring back to most viewers emotions and feelings about the lockdowns that we've already started to repress. Which is really kind of fascinating because, I think about like in the 2008 financial crisis or the response to that, within a couple of years, people were saying, the real problem was the government didn't do anything. I mean, just these fundamentally false memories. And I think we are already going through that with lockdown where, Ron DeSantis, I was always against lockdowns. I was always against this and that. like, in fact, it's good to kind of remind ourselves of what we were thinking, what we were feeling during these massive disruptive events. Station 11 is fantastic.
I loved that book. And it's also interesting that HBO produced both Station 11 and The Last of Us, another kind of post-apocalyptic series that is, it's not like a libertarian series in a direct sense, but it posits a post-apocalyptic future in which after, it's not a virus, it's technically a fungus, but in which essentially after an infection kills a lot of the planet, the federal government sort of takes over and becomes basically an armed gang running a small set of, of enclaves just in horrible, brutal, authoritarian fashion. Like there's a
That's
Nick
The
Offerman,
Last of Us.
right?
Yeah.
In The Last of Us, right? And there's a Nick Offerman character who's like a crazy survivalist who shows up at one point and like is screaming about his partner like gets really mad at him and says, "You live in a crazy world where 9/11 was a conspiracy and the government are all Nazis." And Nick Offerman just looks back and says, "The government are all Nazis." And in the show's world, we're supposed to understand that he is the one who is absolutely, totally correct, at least about that.
I thought the subtitle to The Last of Us should have been The Vindication of Ron Swanson.
No, but it's just notable that the sort of purveyor of, like, in some ways, the chief purveyor of upper middle brow kind of media elite culture, HBO's Sunday night, dramas, has now done 2 of these shows, both of which are at least, skeptical of kind of the world that we lived through in 2020. Katherine, what is it that you have been watching or reading or otherwise consuming?
As this show's lady correspondent, I will stick with the theme and note that I just got around to, I actually listened to the big New York Times Magazine piece on menopause because, that's where we are right now. It was done it dropped on the daily podcast feed, but read kind of as a long form thing. The piece is great, and it's great because it is the story of a failure of scientific communication. So basically, sometime a while back, there had been, it was widely prescribed hormones for women who were going through menopause to deal with side effects of menopause, and there was one study that showed a slightly elevated risk of some kind of cardiovascular side effects for women and a slightly elevated risk of breast cancer for those people who are taking hormones. And overnight, basically, this treatment, people stopped using it. The prescriptions dropped by 60-70% within the first year after the study came out. And it was tiny increases in risk that the press picked up, magnified, overplayed. And the parallels for me are to the failures of communication around COVID, right? So just where do risks really reside? What are the trade-offs for different types of mitigation measures? And then also the communication around opioids. So this idea that suddenly there were millions of women suffering, in some cases very, very serious side effects, hot flashes, osteoporosis, a bunch of, sleeplessness, a bunch of other things, because the risks had been exaggerated by people that they trusted, and they were afraid. They were afraid to use legitimate treatments for a condition that they legitimately had, because they got scared by some bad science communicators. And the piece very directly makes the case that more menopausal women, specifically younger women in their 50s, should be on hormones and aren't right now. It really comes across as advocacy, which I was surprised by. I wouldn't necessarily have expected that from a Times Magazine piece in this style. But there was also a kicker on the piece, which is that a lot of women who feel like they're not being listened to by their doctors just use online services that prescribe these directly. And so it's another case of kind of a technological workaround to a broken institution that's gatekeeping. And so I don't know. I just thought it was, maybe a story that Reason Roundtable listeners might skip, as they are demographically on average not menopausal women. And you shouldn't skip it because it really has so many of the themes that we talk about on this podcast all the time. And it's I think it will be interesting to see, because I think it's quite possible that a New York Times Magazine piece of this size, and they've promoted it everywhere. They've released it on every platform. They've done, takeaway bullet points and podcasts and everything. I assume they will continue to beat this drum. I do think it could genuinely change the standard of practice, because women will go to their doctors and say, hey, give me these hormones. I'd love to check back in again in a year and see if the standard of care changes, which, at least as far as this piece convinced me, it should. So New York Times Magazine, since I spent a lot of this podcast talking smack about other New York Times coverage, I want to say this piece was pretty impressive and had a lot of themes relevant to listeners of this podcast.
I think the workaround of healthcare, and in many ways, women are leading it, because they've had in many ways, the most constrained and vexed relationship with the medical industry for a lot of different reasons, is really, a long running story or a continuing story. That's fantastic. And it fits in so well with so many Reason themes about decentralization and dispersion of information, hence knowledge, and effectively new ways of doing business. And I agree with you, Katherine. That story is phenomenal to read on every possible level, including most basically like the information that's in it, but then what it's illustrating is just phenomenal.
Yeah. And the fact that there's not just one, but actually two online providers of hormone replacement therapy. And they're competing, right? Like there's at the end of the piece, there's like this description of the different services that these two companies provide. And there's a to be sure in there, right? Like there's an example of a woman who is pretty clearly high risk, who's using this service to get hormone replacement therapy, which her doctors would not recommend, and which is probably contraindicated. But it's dealt with quite fairly and quite even-handedly. And yeah, the fact that there's not only a private alternative, but competition in the private space already, I thought was pretty cool.
Since you mentioned themes we talk about on this podcast a lot.
Oh, no, it's a Star Wars.
Oh, it's even better. I watched the third movie in the Ant-Man superhero series and the 30-somethings film.
Ant-Man and the Wasp Menopause?
MCU? Yeah, Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantum Mania. And it's fine, I guess. The whole thing's really sort of flat. The CGI is kind of terrible. It doesn't feel like it's really all that
but
together.
It's fine.
Yeah, it's fine. There's a bunch of odd moments, I think, of maybe some interest to this podcast. Moments of, it's not even politicization. It doesn't even go that far, but just these tossed off gestures at politics. Like there's a moment when Michael Douglas, who's the elder Ant-Man, points to, for reasons, there's in this movie, there's a hyper advanced society of ants that builds like a super society, and he says it makes the case for socialism, and that's just sort of it, right? And then there's a bit at the beginning when the younger Ant-Man's daughter gets arrested for trying to stop San Francisco authorities from clearing a homeless encampment in a park, and then complains about the high prices of housing, because I guess she's like an affordable housing activist, maybe? I don't know. Anyway, MODOK is in it. And everybody loves MODOK. That's for the old school comic book super fans. There's a bunch of actors in superhero costumes shooting finger lasers at each other. Just big finger laser action, plus some post-credit scenes that tease future superhero films, just in case you were not tired of superheroes. There's going to be a lot more Kang in Avengers: The Kang Dynasty. What I'm saying is, it's a Marvel movie, and I watched it. Thank you all for listening. Matt Welch will be back in the pilot's chair next week, trying to bring us to a soft landing. If you like what you hear on this podcast, you can donate at reason.com/donate. That's reason.com/donate. Support our work. Thank you all for listening.